Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now I've probably featured Far Cry 2 in a lot of benchmarking videos over the years. After all, it's 13 years old and will run on just about any modern hardware. We even put together a recommended system requirements PC for the game last year. Every time I play this classic, I'm just as fascinated by it as I am frustrated. Far Cry 2 is a more realistic, hardcore approach to a first-person shooter than its predecessors and successors alike, and I only began to appreciate it when I played through it again a couple of years ago. Then of course Far Cry 6 came out, and while it's a lot of fun, like these games always are, it just made me want to play Far Cry 2 for the third time. Not necessarily for the story either, just for some good old-fashioned destructive fun. I'm sure a lot of you have seen videos comparing Far Cry 2 to 5 and now 2 to 6, and while Far Cry 6 certainly makes some improvements over Far Cry 5, Far Cry 2 remains unmatched in terms of physics and destruction. But why? It all starts with the engine. Far Cry 2 uses a heavily modified version of the Cry engine called the Dunia engine, which includes more realistic physics and destruction, hence the ability for the player to shoot individual twigs off of bushes that, by the way, grow back in real time, start massive fires that spread depending on wind direction, and look on as a single gunshot or small explosion causes a chain reaction worthy of a pre-rendered action-focused cutscene. All of this takes place within an African map that's constantly changing, both in terms of time and weather. The low-quality enemy weapons that occasionally jam, and the brilliant attention to detail when firing rockets at extremely close range and watching them ricochet across the landscape are also noteworthy mentions. The Dunia engine is behind it all, and all of these details add to the experience. The random attacks of malaria, though, well, they add an extra feeling of vulnerability to the game, which works well in combination with the backdrop of a harsh savannah, but in my opinion, they were a bit overdone. Far Cry 2 was part game and part tech demo. It was early days for the Dunia engine, and I'm sure Ubisoft were keen to show off what it could do. What better way was there than to create a playground where destruction and mischief can be used to the player's advantage? I remember pre-release footage and written previews that showcased these very things, and it certainly came from a more detail-obsessed era where the likes of Crysis had already dropped us into a reactive world in which the environment was just part of our loadout. It's a shame that certain aspects caused divisive opinions. I can therefore understand why subsequent Far Cries got rid of weapon jamming, added map-accessed fast travel, and ditched the tropical disease, but I don't get why the more meticulous details took a back seat. This is one of those queries I don't have a definitive answer to. Usually I put forward a question and say, well, it's because this time I can't. Take the fire propagation, for example. Fire is still a very satisfying element in Far Cry, but it's never quite been as well executed as it was in 2008. The same can be said for the object deformation and destruction. Some might argue that it could be technical limitations at play, but you have to remember that even Far Cry 2 came to the Xbox 360 and PS3. It wasn't a PC exclusive like Crysis was at first. Actually, it almost was, from what I've read, but we essentially got the same experience on consoles as we did on PC, aside from the obvious visual downgrades. It ran pretty well too. With all that said, I can't sit here and pretend that Far Cry 2 was a faultless masterpiece or an underrated gem. It was a unique experience that showed off the capabilities of the game's engine, but it did so at the expense of things that newer games have improved upon. I just think the developmental focus was elsewhere when Ubisoft crafted this title, and that can be interpreted as a good or bad thing. Still, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to have a combination of an action-packed story, fast-paced gunplay, as well as the inclusion of little details that might not necessarily change anything, but are there just for the sake of it, to help emphasise the feeling of a living, breathing and dynamic world. To finalise, I want to take a quick look at the performance with age-appropriate graphics cards. After all, any modern system with a half-decent GPU will have no issues pumping out 60 frames per second at 1440p. Visually, it still holds up, and although the brown and green colour palette might put you off in a modern world of bright and vibrant games, there are mods that can change this. The 9800 GT, a mid-range favourite among many back in 2008, will handle the game at high settings with anti-aliasing disabled and the resolution set to 1920 by 1080. There will be a few frame drops here and there, but most of the time the game runs fairly smoothly, even when blowing up everything in sight or setting massive fires. This card came out in July, I believe, and the game released in October. Something a bit lower end now, and it's the turn of the HD 4350 from AMD. We took a look at this the other day as part of our £5 graphics card showdown. It cost $39 new, and although we do have to make some sacrifices to the visuals, namely a DX9 downgrade and lower quality settings, we can still squeeze at least 30 frames per second from it. This brings back a lot of memories. This is how I used to play it on my grandparents' Pentium 4 machine back in the day. Probably with a lot less frames, but the graphics are uncanny. So that's all there really is to it. I wanted to look back at Far Cry 2 because no matter how you feel about it, it's certainly a memorable game that definitely shaped the future of the franchise. A few things were left behind along the way, but despite its technical features, it can be enjoyed on a wide range of hardware, including potato GPUs that are over 10 years old and would have cost less than the game itself at the time. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like on it, leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and in the next one we'll be taking a look at a very cheap PC build. Thank you, and I'll see you again soon.